Mr. Hadley and Mr. Burns, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate the service that you've given to our country and the wisdom that you provided this morning. Thank you also to Chairman Risch and Ranking Member Menendez for your comments and questions and your leadership of this committee. This is, in my view, a critical time for this committee's work, and under the leadership of these two gentlemen, I hope we're able to make the kind of progress that the country needs. Following the Second World War, Dean Acheson, Harry Truman, and others worked together, George Kennan, worked together to establish a foreign policy for our nation, objectives and a strategy, if you will, that we followed quite consistently over the many decades. We now have encountered a very different world than that existed following the Second World War. And there are some, like myself, who believe that we haven't devised a new strategy or even set objectives for what we hope to accomplish over the coming decades or century. One, I question, is that right? Is it, in fact, that we're sort of flailing with an uncertain path in the face of nations like Russia and China that apparently do have very clear objectives and strategies? China's even published them. And if that is the case, let me ask you, how do we go about the process of establishing a clear set of objectives and strategy for our foreign policy going forward? And do you have any suggestions of an element or two or three or whatever that ought to be part of the strategic thinking for the vision for America over the coming decades?
Well, thanks, Senator. I think the first step is to understand the landscape and the way in which it's changed, not since, the era of, Acheson and others, but in the, since the end of the Cold War, which, launched a moment of 20 years or so in which we really were the singular dominant player in the international system. I think we have to recognize that that landscape is more competitive now and recognize also our strengths. I don't think we need to be defeatist about this at all. We still, as I suggested in my opening remarks, have a better hand to play than any of our rivals. The question is how we play it, and I think recognizing that one of our great assets is our ability to draw on alliances, to build partnerships with new emerging countries like India, for example, and then to think strategically about our priorities, which, as both of us suggested, I think has to start with Asia. It doesn't end there. And ironically, I think that makes transatlantic ties more rather than less important, because we both share concerns, we and our principal European allies, about China's rise, about Russia's resurgence. And at the same time, my last point is we also have to take into account that range of truly global challenges well beyond the reach of any one state, whether it's the revolution in technology, climate change, just as two profound examples, and look for ways in which we can take the lead in mobilizing other countries to address them, because those are going to be, especially with regard to climate, I think, a truly existential challenge.
Thank you.
Senator, I would say we need to revise and adapt the international system to reflect the new changed circumstances. The question is it going to be based on our principles or somebody else's? And that's why one of the first steps, something we did at the Atlantic Council, to roll out a declaration of principles that takes the traditional principles under the old order but revises and adapted for the new situation. That begins the process. We're going to have to engage China on these principles, and I think whether we're going to successfully adapt that international system is going to depend a lot on our relationship with China, and that's why I focus so much on my testimony. I think we know the problem. I don't think we have a strategy at this point on China. I think it's one of the things that this committee could really do, to have an intensive set of hearings on China strategy, because I think we know the problem. I don't think we have a strategy. I think it starts by getting ourselves in a position so that we can compete successfully with China. And I think if we do that, there are selective things on which we can get China to cooperate with us. But first, we've got to fix, I think, our foreign policy begins at home. We got to have a firm foundation here at home, engage with China, but make it clear to China that we're also prepared to compete with it. And if they're not willing to cooperate, they'll be on the short end of the stick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.